This is going to be the first of a series of webinars focused on trade in Africa, which we'll be running for the rest of this year, once a month. Thank you very much to Access Bank, who are sponsoring the series of webinars. We're very happy to have them on board. And thank you to all of you for attending. My apologies for the slightly late start, but all of you have taken the time up, so we're going to dive right in. For those who don't know me, my name is Donald Mackay. I am the founder and director of XA International Trade Advisors. Speaking with me today is Francois Fouchier, who is the founder and director of Growth Diagnostics, and also a research associate for the Center for African Markets and Management at Gibbs University. And before we dive into the specific topic of trade and services, Francois is just going to launch everything off with a very quick overview of how we've arrived at where we are now regarding trade in Africa. Francois.
Thank you very much, Donald. You should be able to see the screen, and you should be able to see my first slide at the moment. Is that in fact the case?
Yes, it is.
Okay, excellent. A very good morning to you people. And Donald, thank you. Delighted to be here with you this morning. To kick things off, perhaps just some context and some background to this new trade agreement before we go into the trade and services details with you. Note, people, that what we can cover in an hour is literally just the tip of the iceberg. It is especially true when it comes to trading across borders. The devil is in the detail, and there's quite a bit of detail in this area. So if we compare Africa's contribution to the global population, it represents about 17%. However, Africa's contribution from an economic activity point of view and from a trade point of view are both much less. Another way to say this is to say that Africa is not really known for its economic and trade productivity, especially not on a per capita adjusted basis. And this is just one example of how to slice and dice the numbers to measure it. But regardless of how it is measured, we almost constantly fall short in this measurement. And of course, this is something that the new Africa Trade Agreement wishes to change. It is rather challenging for countries, in my opinion, to become wealthy without engaging in more trade and not becoming more productive, that is. And trade across borders introduces a far greater variety of imports for a nation's consumers, but it is far more than that. It's not only that. It also introduces more competition into a domestic economy, and greater competition is even better for consumers, for prices and for variety of goods and services. So autarky or isolationism is most definitely not the answer to Africa's economic development challenges. So the new trade agreement wants Africa to trade more, but not only with anybody, but more with our continental neighbors in particular. If we just quickly go to the literature, you'll recall that Professor Paul Krugman, which won the Nobel Prize as well, said this about productivity, and I quote, "Productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it almost is everything. A country's ability to improve its standard of living over time depends almost entirely on its ability to raise its output per worker." So, there you have it from the horse's mouth. There is some concern. Some smaller economies in Africa are concerned that the liberalization of trade, which is in essence just the reduction of import tariffs, will bring about only a loss in their fiscal income. However, I should remind you that this does not necessarily have to be the case, since greater levels of trade and the opening up of their economies will likely increase the size of the domestic economies to such an extent that the companies and other taxes, like personal income tax, for instance, that they collect may be increased due to the increased activity, will overshadow the loss of import tariff fiscal income completely, in my opinion. This will only be the case, of course, if the opening up of the economies is managed in a responsible and structured manner and in close cooperation with their tradable goods industries that is. If we go to the next slide. So other parts of the world certainly enjoy more trade with their neighbors compared to Africa with our neighbors. When you have high barriers at the border, less will cross that border. And Africa has high barriers to trade. The low levels of intra-Africa trade reflects the difficulty of trade on the continent. So think of this as a hurdle. The higher the hurdle at or before the border, the less goods, the less people, and the less capital will eventually be able to cross that hurdle. If the hurdle, however, is lowered, more will be able to cross that hurdle. And this is true for goods, this is true for trade in goods, for trade in services, and also for the trade in capital or then money or investment, perhaps in the form of FDI in some instances. When it comes to regional integration in Africa, increased levels of regional integration in Africa is certainly one of the primary aims of the African Union. But the state of integration on the continent varies wildly. In a recent report from the AU, the AfDB, and UNECA, they stated that, and I quote, "If prosperity, social cohesion, and human development are the destination, then regional integration is the path." From that same report, they also found that from an integration point of view, that South Africa was the continent's, regarded as the continent's most integrated country, and South Sudan the least integrated one in Africa. Of course, South Sudan also being the youngest and the newest country in Africa and in the world, if I'm not mistaken. So we may ask, why so little integration on our continent? Well, firstly, average tariffs on product trade in Africa are not that high, but non-tariff barriers are much higher compared to other regions in the world. There was a study done by the World Bank, the data year, or the year for which they did the analysis was 2015, and they calculated the non-tariff trade costs on tradable goods, and they compared different regions in the world. And Africa, was almost double its closest region, at more than 270% of the value of tradable goods. If you look at what the equivalent of that was in advanced economies, that's less than half. So tariffs and non-tariff barriers certainly do pose obstacles to African trade. Tariff structures, however, are complex and varied, even though the average tariffs are not that high on the continent. Non-tariff barriers, however, do remain significant. And even though some African countries have reduced some over the last while, they're still at a very, very elevated level. Of course, they come in multiple forms, such as lengthy customs procedures, overly burdensome sanitary and phytosanitary measures, product standards and licensing requirements. Lack of infrastructure, of course, is also a fairly big challenge. And these factors particularly affect agriculture and food products, which are subject to stringent SBS standards. And these products are perishable, so delays can be very, very costly. So why are trade costs so high? And in order to help us find some perspective in that answer, we turn to the literature again for some perspective, and this time from Professor Milton Friedman, back then from the University of Chicago, also Nobel Prize winner. And he said this about policies and about programs, and I quote, "One of the great mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than by their results." So the reality, the economic reality that we face on the continent today is a function of past policies and programs. And maybe they didn't intend to deliver the results that we currently have, but that certainly is the result. So we've got to go back to the drawing board and re-look at how we look at trade policy and industrial policy in conjunction with each other. Another question that is useful to ask here is perhaps to ask that should there be a focus on making it easier to import as well, not only be so fixated on increased levels of exports? And the answer is most definitely yes. And why? Well, the why behind it is because mercantilism is certainly not the answer today anymore. Exports are not necessarily more important than imports to a country. Certainly not in a world, in the modern, globally connected and globalized world that we live in, especially also not one that is dominated by global value chains. Intermediary imports are equally important to drive local production processes and to produce new products domestically to export again, especially for countries with small domestic economies like South Africa. If we go to the next slide. So the promise behind the new continental trade agreement. A single market in Africa is very attractive given its collective quantum, if you wish, which is not insignificant, as you can see from the numbers here. And certainly it's far more attractive than a bunch of smaller, less integrated countries for business to be conducted in. And the idea behind the new Africa Trade Agreement is to create one of the world's largest free trade areas. The new Africa Trade Deal would be the largest trade agreement in the world if it is measured by the number of countries that participate in it. But it is a tough road ahead, people, with several of the CFTA trade negotiations still not complete, and there are many obstacles in the way to get the agreement to full implementation. The new trade agreement is a very ambitious AU, African Union initiative, and note that it is an AU initiative, doesn't stand on its own feet. So to date, 54 countries have signed the agreement, but only 41 have in fact ratified the agreement. Eritrea is the only country on the continent that remains outside, this progressive continental initiative. What is a bit worrying down here in the south is that Botswana, of course, which is a member state of SACU, the South African Customs Union, of which South Africa is a member state as well, have not ratified the agreement as yet. South Africa and all the other SACU member states, however, have already ratified the agreement. So, of course, getting agreement among African states is not easy during normal conditions. The pandemic in the middle of all of this, and now even a war, fortunately not in Africa, has certainly not helped the external environment. But let's look at back to trade and services again. What can we say about trade and services? What we can say is that trade and services is much harder to measure, especially in Africa. Trade in goods is better captured even in Africa. And international trade and services, it's not well captured, but we do know the levels of it is fairly low, especially in Africa. With trade in goods, we have plenty of granular data, many data points. It's big data's, it's a dream environment for big data. We have about 8,500 tariff lines for South Africa as an example, but only a few categories for trade and services, to compare. At the global level, trade in goods is far more matured than trade in services and is about 3 times larger in quantum. So trade in goods is estimated to at the global level, approximately $16 trillion. So this also means the other side of the coin is that there's more scope for trade and services to grow if we were to compare it to the potential growth for trade in goods. We look at the next slide, the objectives of the new trade agreement. The primary promise is to make it easier to do business across the continent. But this should be seen as the start of a journey, not as a single event. And realistically speaking, people, we should expect decades to go by before we could expect to reach something that represents full implementation of the new agreement. The CFTA is part and parcel of a gradual harmonization of African trade and investment policies to facilitate much greater levels of intra-Africa trade and investment. The first priority of the new trade deal is to broaden Africa's economic and market space. But there are also other priorities linked to the agreement, and they include to address the supply side constraints that we face on the continent, to address the weak productive capacities that we face, and also to address the infrastructure bottlenecks that we experience. But the interesting thing about the new trade agreement is very modern, it's very comprehensive, but it's seen as more than just a free trade agreement. It's also seen as a platform that can facilitate a process of inclusive structural transformation that can contribute to Africa's very ambitious Agenda 2063 vision, and also that can progress Africa towards implementing the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, those elusive ones. But it is negotiated in phases, this new trade deal. Phase 1 includes the trade in goods and the trade in services. Phase 2, the protocol extends to investments, to competition policy, to intellectual property rights, and then to the movement of business people across borders. And then lastly, phase 3 will deal with e-commerce. We look at the history of the new trade agreement in the context of of African integration. The CFTA has been very long in the making. It started with the Continental Customs Union that was put forward in the Abuja Treaty almost 30 years ago. Then the AU was established with integration as a primary objective. We fast forward another decade. The AU Assembly adopted what is known today as the sister agreement to the CFTA, which is the BIAT, the Boosting Intra-Africa Trade Action Plan, which formed the roadmap of the CFTA as we know it today. And then the AU Summit affirmed their commitment to fast-track track it in 2016, and then the agreement between African Union countries was eventually signed in Kigali during March of 2018. And this has now followed years of negotiations and preparations, and recently, of course, it's been it faced months of delays due to the global pandemic. Eventually, we started trading on the 1st of January 2021. Although that's a controversial statement because it's a little bit more complicated than that. Maybe we have time during the Q&A to go into some of that. What has happened, however, over time is a very complex net of regional economic communities in Africa have emerged. The problem is that we've got many countries on the continent that actually belong to more than one of these regional economic communities, as you can see from the illustration. So there's a very large amount of overlap on these REC memberships, which creates a very complex trade setup. The problem is that border posts are not nearly as sophisticated in, between many of these African countries. And the result is we have less intra-Africa trade taking place. So there are 13 regional economic communities in Africa. Some of these RECs are quite advanced in terms of regional integration, the EAC, for instance. But of course, SACU down here, where we are in our part of the world, plays a very large and important integration role on the continent. And in fact, SACU is the oldest customs union in the world, much older than the European equivalent, and it was established in 1910. Interesting fact for you here, there are 55 countries in Africa after South Sudan became the latest one. There are 5 member states in SACU, of which South Africa is one. Remember, that's Lesotho, that's Eswatini, that's South Africa, that's Botswana, that's Namibia. But more than 50% of total intra-Africa trade actually takes place within SACU. So that's 5 countries within 55 on the continent that makes up more than half of the intra-Africa trade. If you extend the footprint not to the 5 member states of SACU, but to the 15, 16 of SADC, that intra-regional trade representation goes up to 75%. Of course, the new trade agreement, the new CFTA, recognizes not all 13 of these RECs, but only 8 of those. And the 8 are, it's SACU, of course, it's SADC, it's ECAS, it is COMESA, it is ECOWAS, it is the EAC, it is IGAD, it is SENSAT, and then it is also the AMU. Then lastly, before I hand over to Donald, to illustrate the complexity of so many of the regional agreements, look at this summary of policy areas in some of these African regional agreements that we have. Some policy areas are covered by some agreements, but the older agreements like SACU, for instance, cover a limited number of policy areas, whereas the later, more modern CFTA agreement covers a significantly more comprehensive set of policy areas. The only policy areas that are not covered by the new Africa trade deal are in fact only 4, and those are state aid, it is public procurement, it is environmental laws, and it is labor market regulations. However, I should add that labor market regulations and environmental laws are covered in some of the regional preferential trade agreements on the continent, like the EAC and COMESA. Public procurement is not included in any preferential trade agreement except in the EAC. And then lastly, trade and services, however, are covered under the new CFTA, but it is not covered by SACU, for instance, to give you an example. Donald, and I think with that, that is the end of my contribution. So allow me to stop sharing my screen and you can take it over from here. Let me stop that and you should be able to show you. And yeah, and we can see yours. Excellent. Thank you. Donald, you are on mute.
My apologies. Let me start over again.
Now we can hear you. Now we can hear you.
Thank you, Francois. The WTO, in its General Agreement on Trading Services, identifies 12 services of interest, which are looked at by the agreement. We're not going to spend too much time on each individual service. Instead, we're more interested in how these services are delivered. So importantly, when we deal with the service as opposed to a physical product, you would typically not move in the service through a customs authority, which creates a natural point at which you can collect data which is all the trade stats that Francois spoke about, that natural point doesn't exist. Also, you have no ability to levy a duty on a service. So there are other ways, however, that countries go about restricting the movement of services across borders. And this is part of the challenge, a very big part of the challenge we see in trade in services in Africa. So to Andre's earlier comment, information, solid, reliable data on trade in services is simply not available at the moment to the same level of reliability or detail that we can get on goods. The first mode of delivery would be delivering the service without capital or people. So the example I'm giving here is exactly something like we're doing now. We can have people from all over the continent signing in and attending this. There is no need for us to move any of our money into a training facility in another country. We don't need to send people over the border. The service can be delivered with very low risk to the capital and the people. So you see a little risk monitor in the bottom right-hand corner for each mode of delivery. That's really important. That's something we've created, but I think helps to explain why certain services struggle to move across borders more than others, where we need to focus our attention to help services move more freely. The second mode of delivery is people come into the country to buy a service. So I'm in South Africa. If a tourist came to South Africa from elsewhere on the African continent, they would arrive here and they would consume whatever we have in South Africa, our food, our entertainment, our travel services, whatever else may occur in the country. But importantly, the tourist arrives with their own capital, their own money in their pocket, and they physically arrive into the country, and that changes the risk somewhat. The reason we see more tourists going to areas which do not have conflict or not at war is because the chances are much better that when a tourist arrives, their money is not going to be taken or they are not going to come to physical harm. And so the environment needs to be attractive in order for tourism, as an example, for people to arrive here and consume our stuff in South Africa, likewise for any other country on the continent. The third mode, and this is really the gold standard for what every country would like to achieve, is an example here of a bank or an insurer deciding to move their service into a new country. And in the process of doing that, they make a physical investment. There's branches of the bank are set up. They send people across the border. And here you will see the risk moves up fairly substantially, which is why we see far fewer banks making investments in other countries than we see tourists coming to South Africa or tourists traveling to other countries to consume their services. The longer you have to keep your capital in the other country and the longer people have to stay there, the greater the risk becomes to both of those categories, of course. And so around this, to drive up this critical service, the environment that service moves into is a very big deal indeed. Mode 4 is that people come into the country to deliver the service. And the most obvious example here is logistics. You want to get your product delivered into South Africa, you've got to put it onto a truck out of Mozambique and send it to South Africa. Every time a truck crosses the border, the owner of that truck has a risk on the capital invested in that truck. Should the truck come to harm because it's attacked, there's civil unrest, the roads are in bad condition and the truck gets harmed, or there's a risk to the driver, that service is less likely to be delivered. And the cost of that service will increase. So we see the cost of delivering the service, the logistics service, will drive up the cost of the physical goods moving across the border. So there's a double whammy if we have an environment where the movement of services is not well enabled. If we can't move our money around, if we can't move our goods around, then trade overall slows down. Talking to one of the reasons why Francois had mentioned earlier, that we see Africa with such very, very low levels of intra-Africa trade. So I'd like you to look at this fairly busy slide and bear in mind the objectives that Francois had touched on earlier. The objectives of the Continental Agreement, in summary, are to create a single continental market for goods and services, to expand intra-African trade through better harmonization and coordination of trade liberalization. Of course, this is services, not just goods. Expedite the regional and continental integration process, enhance competitiveness at the industry and enterprise level. Now, bearing that in mind, we'll look at the triangle on the right-hand side. In order for goods or services to be moved, there has to be some sense that your capital is safe, let alone going to generate a return. In other words, when you send the truck over the border, you want to have a reasonable assurance the truck will come back. You want to have a reasonable assurance that your driver or the workers that you might send along with your bank investment into a new country will be safe and secure. If these two parts of the triangle are not in place, then trade simply doesn't happen. The bottom part of the triangle, I really see as foundational and a really big problem in the context of African trade particularly, which is dispute resolution. So inside of any given country, we tend to not think of dispute resolution that much when we trade. When you walk into a shop and you buy something from the shop, you have a reasonable expectation that after you've paid for your goods and you get to the door of the shop, the owner of the shop is not going to say to you, you cannot leave with the goods, or that they want an extra payment before you can take your goods out. You have a reasonable assurance that if you want to return something, you understand the rules and terms of that exchange. If that is not honored, you need to understand that you have recourse. What can you do about that? Well, if it's a big enough problem, you can go to court, the arbitration mechanisms. Dispute resolution in the context of Africa simply does not work as well as it should. By example, a number of years ago when Mugabe was still in charge in Zimbabwe, he imposed a rule without any notice, attaching an extra border levy for goods coming out of South Africa into Zimbabwe in breach of the SADC agreement. Rob Davies was Minister of Trade and Industry at that time, and he simply refused to address it. Because of that, what happens is the trade simply diminishes, and there's harm created both to the exporting country and the importing country, which now faces inflationary pressures, higher costs for goods and unavailability of critical goods. Until Africa can resolve the issue of dispute resolution, it becomes quite academic that we have an agreement. If we have a look at the other agreements we have in Africa, and I'm going to focus particularly on those in Southern Africa, then we see that those agreements already don't work particularly well. Let me give you a real example related to services at the moment. So this relates to a mode for service. In other words, people are coming into the country to deliver the service, or we are sending people into another country to deliver our service. We're talking here about transport, which has been all over the media recently. We've seen trucks stopped on the N3. We've seen the N3 highway blocked. We've seen trucks burnt, drivers attacked, etc. Now, the Department of Transport, in response to all of this, has proposed a piece of legislation that says we're going to prohibit foreign nationals who do not have South African professional driving permits from driving South African trucks. And this may seem like a very obvious way to resolve the problem, but in fact, what it does is it creates a whole new layer of problems to deal with. So the first issue is we have a concept of mutual recognition between all SACU states and all SADC states. And the mutual recognition deals particularly with this issue of professional driving permits. If you look at Article 27 of the SACU agreement, we agree to extend to motor operators registered in the other states treatment that is no less favorable than that we accord to our own domestic operators. In the SADC agreement, it's in fact explicitly stated that each member state shall recognize driving licenses issued According to agreed SADC codes and format by the other member states, the provision of this article shall also apply to professional driving permits. In other words, the agreements are already set up to allow foreign drivers to move between countries. And if you think about it, that's a really important component of having an efficient logistics service. Imagine for a moment, every time you want to move goods across the border, you have to swap the driver at the border. And so we would move goods between different countries. Already, as this has been very seriously looked at, and in fact is looking likely to be passed a little bit later this year, there are already discussions happening in other African countries to look at forms of retaliation. So this is certainly not going to pass without affecting the rest of our trade. Of course, as we impose a rule like this, we deal with the question of whether the rule can actually be implemented, how the bureaucracy will deal with issuing what would no doubt be thousands and thousands of new professional driving permits, how we are going to deal with the Metro Police being able to enforce all of these rules. But overall, what is going to happen is the cost of moving goods between African states is going to increase. Ironically, driving trade outside of Africa, where you don't have this problem, when you ship goods in and the product lands in Durban port, you don't face a similar problem to when goods are moving from other African countries. These are not the only rules being considered at the moment, which appear to have a very direct impact on the rest of Africa. We have the Gauteng Township Economy Bill, which seeks to set aside certain businesses in Gauteng townships, which can only be operated by South Africans. We have a look at the proposed amendments to our labor legislation, reserving certain jobs for South Africans. Bear in mind, all of this is happening in the context of a broader trade agreement which seeks to liberalize the movement of services, people, and goods within Africa. So as we keep imposing laws which restrict that, we should go back and just recall the quote by Milton Friedman, which Francois noted earlier, that you should not judge programs and policies by their intentions, but rather by their outcomes. And what we're finding is an increasing number of laws, not just on services, but on goods as well, which actively seek to restrict the movement of goods. Yet at the same time, we're making very public statements that we're all behind Africa doing more trade with the rest of Africa. And certainly on trading goods, if we take a look from 2010 to now, as a percentage of our trade, our volume of trade within the SADC region, for example, has fallen. In other words, we're doing more and more trade outside of the SADC region, and this is an agreement that we've had in place for quite a number of years already. So bringing us to a question, if all of this is occurring, why is it that we have trade agreements? So the objective of any trade agreement is to encourage trade between the member states. When the EU was created, which is currently the world's largest trade agreement, when the EU was created, the objective was to drive more and more trade inside of the EU member states, or between the EU member states. And likewise, with the trade agreements that we are setting up in Africa, the objective is to do more trade. If we don't align our policies and our laws to this objective, then all we will find over time is that the amount of trade we have functionally drops and does not increase. This is particularly important for services, again, where we don't have an ability to easily measure the volume of services moving from one country to another. So quite a lot of harm can be done to services before the data comes out supporting that view, which means we've got to be catching the bad policies at the time that they are created, rather than waiting for them to simply manifest. And many of these are very obvious. However, and we'll deal with this in a moment, we very often don't look beyond the obvious. So we tend to not look beyond the obvious fact that we have a problem with unemployment. And what we do is we say the solution to the unemployment problem is to stop a foreign driver arriving here, which of course has the very opposite effect and restricts the amount of trade, makes it harder for our drivers to move around, and so the circle continues. The SADC Protocol in services came into force in January 2022, and here's a good example of something which is on paper is designed to drive up the number of trade-in services, yet over half of the signatories to the main agreement placed provisions under their country-specific schedule of commitments to allow them to act inconsistently to the main agreement. In other words, you commit to opening your market for certain services in the main agreement. When you get down to the details of your specific country, you then remove that obligation. And again, all of this talks to not getting to the objective that we really have. We open one door on the one hand and we close the door with the other hand. So what can we do to improve trade in services in Africa? How can we trade more services inside of Africa? Well, probably the most immediate issue is for business to realize and really internalize that businesses trade and governments don't. Much of the agreement, the continental agreement, as with most of the other trade agreements we have in Africa, are purely political. They have no component of them which looks at the actual business position within different regions. So there tends to be very little participation. Business is not insisting on enough good quality information. There's very little interaction at the aggregate level between business and the negotiators. And consequently, what we're finding with this agreement, as with many others, the agreement will simply be what it'll be. And it will arrive kind of ready-baked to be consumed or not, as the case might be. But because the agreement is not being carefully aligned with the companies that trade or wish to trade their services in Africa, the probability of the service being functional or the agreement being functional and the service moving, of course, dramatically reduces. And that, folks, is the end of our presentation. I see we do have some questions. Francois, should we begin perhaps addressing the questions?
Yeah, Donald. There were quite a few people asked whether recording and the slides, just some logistics, whether we'll make this available, and the answer is yes. Both will be made available. A copy of the slide deck and the webinar recording as well. Andre from Standard Bank asked a question about data and data about the trade in services, and particular data about trade in services in Africa. If you look at the UNCTAD quarterly updates that they put out about global trade in services, and you look at their summary intro slide, usually in their summaries, you'll find that they reported for all continents and all regions in the world, with the exclusion of Africa. South Africa's trade and services, you can certainly get quite a bit from the balance of payments, which is part of the national accounts compiled by the Reserve Bank in our instance. But as I've mentioned, during my presentation, the granularity at which trade and services data is made available, and unfortunately this is not the case in Africa, at all, is much lower than the granularity and the luxury of the data points that we have in trade in products. And this is very frustrating. And I agree with you that we would like to have more data in order to be able to do proper analysis. But unfortunately, I don't have any the secret hideaways for great data repositories on trade and services for Africa. So unfortunately, the answer there is we have what you have, and nothing more. So apologies to disappoint you with that. That's also, of course, an area where it should be stepped up. It's incredibly difficult to make informed evidence-based policy decisions without proper data backing those up. That's it from my side, Donald.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I mean, the challenge we've got with services, which is not an easy problem to solve, is you lack a border post. The reason we have much better quality, although a long way from perfect, but the reason we have much better quality data on physical goods is that you can't move the goods across the border until you have completed some information. If you consider this webinar, this is a service being offered across the border, but there's no ability to track the service. And bearing that in mind, that can make it very difficult. You know, if there's not an obligation to disclose information, it can be extremely difficult to gather the information. So I think for a long while yet, we are going to struggle to at least some degree. Some of that is attempted to be addressed through the Reserve Bank, for example, as money flows. But as most people would know, those declarations through the banks are very often simply incorrect. We don't have a structured process to classify services, value services in the way that we do goods. So Andre, it's a fairly grim answer, but unfortunately, I don't see that altering soon. Francois, we have another question.
Yes, yes. How will the different levels of development or competitiveness influence the implementation of the agreement? Well, if I can quickly give my 2 cents worth on this, is this is a big issue that has been raised, on so many different platforms and at so many different occasions over many decades, is to say that, is Africa in fact ready for something as ambitious as this new trade deal? If you look at that regional integration report from UNCTAD and from the AfDB, I think it's in 2020, 2019, you can clearly see that the levels of development vastly different across the continent. South Africa is the most, it's not the largest economy in the continent anymore, but it certainly is the most diversified, most definitely the most industrialized country on the continent, and also the most connected one. And if you look at the trade patterns are very much focused within the RECs, concentrated within the RECs. There is cross-trade flows taking place, but they're fairly thin and narrow. Wouldn't it have been easier to just to grow the RECs on their own and sort of expand their footprint? And that's all, but that's also part of the reason why the CFTA recognizes some of the RECs and does not recognize all of the RECs. So I think that's a good principle when it comes to the new trade agreement. But people, do not be mistaken, the full conclusion or the full implementation of the new agreement, or the new Africa trade deal, it's going to be a lengthy process for the very reason is that levels of development are so vastly different, across the continent. And the agreement per se is not going to make any difference to that. I think more open policies, openness with regards to everything, openness with regards to the flow of money across borders, people like and services that we speak about, products across borders, but openness to attract also additional know-how into the smaller economies in order to grow those economies, to unlock economic growth in them, is what is necessary for those economies to grow. And until we see those level of changes taking place, I don't think we should expect some of the smaller states to grow at a particularly fast pace, which is a real pity. And I think it's necessary for those things to happen so we can get closer to each other, so it'd be easier to integrate. That is my 2 cents worth on that, Donald.
Yeah, I maybe just add something. If we consider one of Francois's earliest slides, I'm going to quickly put it up on the screen. I think it is helpful. Let me quickly share this slide. So this slide over here tells a really important story. So Francois had spoken of productivity earlier on. So if you have a look at the relationship between those 3 charts, what it is telling you is your per capita GDP, the amount of productive value you are adding in your country is extremely low in Africa. And the per capita amount of trade you were doing, in other words, how much trade kind of runs through every member of a population, is unusually low in Africa compared to any other region. Now, the Continental Agreement is designed to certainly improve that position, but you should start off by saying we already have many agreements. If we take the SADC agreement, why is it that we're doing less, not more trade within SADC, for example? We have agreements, but we're not looking at why those agreements don't work at the moment. Instead, what we're doing is we're tacking another one on. And until we understand why it is that African states don't trade with each other, it becomes very hard for me to see how, irrespective of level of development, that process changes by adding another agreement. This is not, by the way, to say that I think the agreement's a bad idea. I'm a huge and very vocal supporter of the idea of an African continental agreement. But I also think we've got to ask ourselves a question: why is it that goods and services don't move as freely as we would like them to with the provisions we already have? And if you were to take the very chart that you were looking at now, and if you were to look at that for China, that chart would essentially be inverted. And that's important to understand. Why is it that per capita GDP in Africa is as low? And a part of the problem is we are not addressing our productivity problems. Inability to trade reduces productivity. And at the same time, a lack of productivity makes it more difficult to trade. So it becomes more appealing to do trade with more productive regions because their services or their goods are cheaper. That's the net effect of being more productive. Francois, that was to kind of add on to your comment.
Yeah, perhaps, Donald, could I just quickly get something in here? Perhaps some perspective here with the new Africa trade agreement in particular. Don't think that trade agreements, if you look at the hype around this new Africa trade deal, it's been talked up, by so many politicians from so many countries on the continent. It has been, never in my life have I seen so many people from so many different walks of life write and talk about a trade deal, and mind you, this one being in Africa. But it's been completely overhyped and it's been completely oversold by if you were to follow the mainstream media. If you were to read the research and you actually follow the process and you look at the history and some of the facts that we've shared here this morning, it is I think we provide a far more realistic view in terms of what we can expect to happen on the continent. We've spoken to so many SMMEs which have said that they can't wait for the implementation date of the CFTA because then Africa is simply going to open up overnight. Now, it couldn't be further from the truth. Last thing I want to mention here is that don't think this is unique to what has happened in Africa just now. Bill Clinton in 1992 said when NAFTA was created, the North American Free Trade Area between Canada, the US and Mexico, he said that, and he's a clever guy, he is a very, very talented individual, a man of many talents it turns out, but nevertheless, he said he found it extremely difficult to explain back then the whole concept of revealed comparative advantage, for instance, which is the old Ricardian, way of looking at a trade analysis and the like. But there's a clever guy in a fairly sophisticated, well-developed, industrialized OECD countries, and he found it difficult, to explain to the citizens the benefit of free trade. Now, you take that and you look at Africa. It is extremely difficult to unlock the value of free trade if we don't have free trade, or to sort of sell it. And the agreement is a wonderful, have phenomenal ambitions. It is very ambitious, but it is extremely progressive. It is everything that is good in there is in there. But the implementation thereof versus the promises are two very, very, very different worlds. And that is the biggest frustration that I've had in Africa, in my life, is that what is being said and what is being promised versus what is being delivered are like it's like two different worlds. This is not unique to Africa. It happened on the RCEP agreement as well 2 years ago in Asia. It gets oversold, and it takes longer to deliver on the benefits of that because you need consensus decision making, and to get consensus among very strong armed leaders can sometimes be a real challenge. Thank you.
Francois, to the second question, please can you shed light on the roles of improved trading services in the AfCFTA in improving economic growth and providing decent employment opportunities, especially for youths? Which services sectors are more promising? My view on this is that the lowest of all of the low-hanging fruit has got to be tourism. Tourism has the benefit that someone else capitalizes the trip, they pay for it, they bring their money with them, they come to you, and all you have to do is make it easy for them to enter the country. It's not helped if you take South Africa, changing our visa requirements, you might recall a while ago, something which we've never entirely recovered from. But something like tourism has got to be the easiest service to enable in any country. And yet, and of course, we do see reasonable amounts of tourists coming into South Africa. We see reasonable amounts of tourism within Africa. And one of the services we can measure better, because again, there's a physical border that you need to cross in order for the service to be delivered. You can't enjoy your vacation until you've handed your passport in and driven or flown across the border. I think personally that the lowest hanging fruit we have in Africa at the moment is tourism. I think it's not something particularly difficult for many countries to work on, and makes a huge difference. I don't believe you need to have terribly high skills. It works well for young folk to be involved with tourism. So I think that if I had to pick one, I would say that would be the service most easily implemented. I also think on the logistics front, we have to give very careful thought to how we deal with moving goods across borders. Ravesha asked the question, is the main factor in the decrease of SADC trade volumes due to logistics barriers within the regional community? I do think that is a factor. I doubt it's the only factor. But we must remember, over a period of time, countries don't remain static. Countries we compete with both inside and outside of Africa also don't remain static. As countries become more competitive at producing a good or a service, the inclination would always be to consume the service from the most productive and competitive country. I do not believe Africa's competitiveness levels have been keeping pace with the rest of the world. In other words, there's a baked-in disincentive to consume a local African product if the local African product is increasingly costing you more. By example, if we get back to logistics, think for a moment of the infrastructure you have to drive your truck on. If you consider the state of South Africa's roads now, and you consider the state 10 years ago, it is going to be costing you more to drive a vehicle on South Africa's roads at the moment because of the state of the roads. That serves the same function as a tax. And consequently, as the continent makes itself less competitive, whether deliberately or accidentally, the effect is that patterns of consumption shift to more competitive areas. Francois, I'm not sure if you have a view on that.
Yeah, the non-tariff barriers that I've mentioned is absolutely key, people. We can fiddle with a reduction in tariffs via, removing them over time and forcing them to zero. But on the other side of the coin, it doesn't make it easier to move the goods. In Africa, it's very much a question of getting the goods to the border, getting the goods across the border, and then moving it to final point in country to its destination. And all three of those legs are extremely time consuming and expensive to do so. So the minute you start to address those three pillars, all of a sudden you'll see far more inter-regional trade taking place. The big thing that people sometimes, perhaps a concluding remark from my side, Donald, big thing that people sometimes forget is that international trade matters are very often not really international trade dilemmas that need to be solved, challenged. It's mostly domestic issues that emerge when we talk to our trading partners about certain things. And when things are not all so well and good back home, they emerge as stumbling blocks for us to trade with our partners. And this is more so the case in Africa with our neighbors than it is between South Africa, for example, and many of the OECD countries that we trade with. So I cannot emphasize this enough. I mean, I feel like a broken record over the last few years and how many times I've said this, but it needs to be cheaper and it needs to be faster in order to move goods, people and capital across borders. When we achieve that environment or that goal, significantly more will flow across borders. And South Africa, with a small economy, and this is far more true for many of the other African countries, which are even smaller in terms of economic activity, need to focus beyond their borders for growth opportunities. But you can't really focus beyond your borders for growth opportunities if you don't do two things. If you don't produce things, and you need to make a wide array of diverse things, and you need to be able to make them very competitively. And competitiveness means you need to be connected and you need to have infrastructure if you want to play the game of getting wealthy via becoming an increasingly larger net exporter. That, of course, has been the Chinese model over the last 4 decades. Doesn't mean it's the only model, but if you're a small economy and you're open, like many of these African nations are, including South Africa, those are characteristics that don't really work for you if you want to focus on your domestic economy. So the growth is beyond the border, people, but you need to be in shape if you want to capitalize on that. Thank you, Donald.
Yeah. I'd maybe thank everyone for joining. Thank you to Access Bank again for sponsoring this webinar. We will be running one of these per month until the end of the year. We will be making available to everyone that attended a copy of the presentation. In a couple of days from now, all of you that attended will also receive just a short note summarizing the issues that we covered here, and also giving you some additional data that you might find useful. I'd maybe just close by saying that we all live in Africa and we all want to see Africa thrive. To get to that point, though, I think it is important for business to own the problem of trade. Francois's comment that many of our trade problems originate with problems back home is absolutely accurate. If you look at the future impact that will occur through the sale, for example, of all of the spectrum that's occurred, a little bit late, but nevertheless still a good thing, giving everyone access in the near future, hopefully, to increased internet speeds, lower cost of connecting to the internet. Those are the kind of things that enable whole other sectors to immediately become more competitive. And if we look back at China, but particularly around 10 or 15 years ago, China had figured out something very clever, which was if you subsidized certain absolute primary industries, steel, energy, glass, aluminium, that you didn't have to spread that money too far to enable many other sectors to become more competitive. Whether or not that's legitimate is debatable. Of course, there are issues with China's subsidies, and it creates havoc around the world. But importantly, by enabling highly competitive foundational industries, everything else that you make in that country that is made out of steel, that consumes electricity, is immediately more competitive. And we should look at services. Many of our services, logistics, communication, etc., underpin the movement of goods. If we fix the service, if we make the services more competitive, there's certainly a geared effect into other sectors beyond the delivery of just the banking or financial service, for example. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you to everyone who joined. If there are any closing questions, we should take them now. Otherwise, we will close off. You'll hear from us shortly when you're given a copy of the presentation and the recording. Thank you.